What is the long-term impact of disc release in the lumbar spine? Well, that's a great question. And what we've found out over the last 12 years and now documented is that for at least 5 years or so, our impact on the discs in the lumbar spine with the releases is minimal. And while there's a lot of resistance to what we do, it's really a misunderstanding of what we do. But let me share the screen for a minute because this will be pretty obvious once I show some data. Uh-oh. Yeah, there we go. So let me just, this is a thoracic curve, but let's jump down to the lumbar data. But let me take one step back because the release is how did we get here, right? So if I go up to this slide, now this is a very busy slide, but this goes back to, we went back over 700 of our surgeries that I did from 2014 to 22. And we ended up grouping them into the early cases where here's 20 of those, 19 in this group, 13 in this group, 25 in this group. These are basically different time frames over the last 12 years, but the early cases were no releases, but they were still an open transthoracic surgery compared to the endoscopic VBT technique. I started with the first stage of what I did was to modify it to an open. So my results were still better than the VBT results endoscopically because I was doing the opens. But in that category of patients, that's no releases with a single screw line. Then we did single screw line with less than 3 levels of releases. And then we did double screw lines with less than 3 releases, double screw lines with more than 4 releases, and like our most modern technique. This is applying to thoracic curves, but this next slide is going to be the lumbars. And what you can clearly see over our history of the 12 years is dramatic improvements in terms of what? Well, the original surgeries of VBT was just like your reported VBT result, except a little bit better because we did the open technique and we could get better corrections. But our pre-op curves went down to about 23 to 28 degrees at final follow-up of about 75 months. So, 5+ years of follow-up. But the revisions were slightly higher. We had 3 out of 20, 4 out of 20. Then as you increase the number of releases, here's single screw line with less than 3 releases. All of a sudden, we're going down a little bit on our revisions. We're going up a little bit on our success rates. Now starting to break away from the original VBT results, which are still there today. The VBT results are about 50 to 60% success rates. Then we migrated into the dual screw lines with less than 3 releases in the thoracic spine. And clearly, you start to see a big drop or improvement in the correction. So from an average of 24 to 28 degrees, now we're between 16 and 21 degrees. And you start adding more than 4 releases with the 2 screw lines in the last since 2020 on, 2019 on. And we dramatically improve our correction rates down to 9 degrees to 17 degrees, 17 being the overall curve, 9 being the instrumented curve. And what you really dramatically see is a drop off in revision rates and increase up to 96% success rates. Now, that's a preliminary study of the different categories, but we followed that up this past year and just submitted this data. I presented it. And we took 322 consecutive cases. We went for the thoracic curves 40 to 70 degrees. So we had 150 cases. We had 127% that we could include more than 2-year follow-ups. That's 85% follow-up. And we broke them down into less than 3 and over 6 releases. And what you can clearly see is even though the less than 3 did fairly well, 91% success of keeping them under 30 degrees, they had a high breakage rate, 55%. The impact of the breakages did not translate into a high revision rate. I believe that's because of my open technique. But once we went to over 6 releases, the data is overwhelmingly better. 96% success rate of getting every curve under 30 degrees, only 7%. There was only one case out of the 46 basically that increased above 30 degrees and did not require a revision anyway because it was balanced. And then the pain scores that go along with that. So everyone's concerned, are you creating pain? Well, our pain scores keep showing the same general trend, which is the pain before surgery on average is higher than the pain after the surgery. And this is at almost 3 years after surgery. So that's the thoracic data. And then going to your question about, or the question about the lumbar is even more striking. So what we were able to do was since prior to 2021, I was releasing all the thoracics, but not releasing the lumbars. I have a group and I went back and I pulled up 34 of them that had no releases in the lumbar spine. So basically they were getting open VBT in the lumbar. I don't like to call it VBT, even in the lumbar, because it was an open technique with the dual screw lines, whereas the endoscopic technique, lateral approach of standard VBT. But basically, the principle, no releases. To 47 patients who had all releases in the lumbar spine. So the average number of releases was 4.5 or so in the lumbar spine. Results are divergent. There's only 73% success rate, and the patients had no releases, meaning I corrected them, and then over the next 2 years, they broke their cords and they rebounded. So they may have been, if you can look at the degree of improvement, the first standing X-ray is very similar. A little bit better with the more releases because you get more derotation. So 5 to 6 degrees, 6 to 11 degrees in the ones with no releases. So pretty decent. But by 48 months, 4 years later, 3 years later, you broke your cords and you rebounded up to 23 to 27 degrees. So still, for the vast majority, considered successful, 25 out of 34, because it stayed below 30 degrees. But that's different than being neutral. It rebounds to 30. In the groups that had the releases, it stays where we put them. So I got them down to 8 to 11 degrees. I'm sorry, 5 to 6 degrees. They're between 8 and 11 degrees at 3 years after the surgery. The number of breakages, dramatically less. You're going to expect the cords to break. And that's the whole concept of the release, which is that I don't count on the release to hold the curve correction. We're counting on the healing of the spine after the release of the contractures to reheal, which it does, and then hold it as opposed to the cord. So even if the cords break, they don't have a big impact. So here, 70% of the cords broke. 8 out of 47 patients could find a slight increase in their curves, but not a big enough increase to do a revision. And so the revision rate in the unreleased lumbar curves was up to 21%, and the revision rate is 1 or 2.5% or so out of the curves that were in this group. And when we go back and fine tune that analysis, what's the most striking thing is that the breaks occur at the unreleased levels. So if you look here, all the obviously no releases in the lumbar group, they all occurred at released levels. In this group where the cord breakage occurred, it occurred at an unreleased level. And so there were no breaks at released levels. And our data is so robust, not just this study, but the other ones we're coming out with, which I can break it down into. I released just the upper lumbar, and then I started to release more of the lumbar. And we can see that where I released in the upper lumbar holds, but then the lower lumbars that were not released break and rebound. And they don't rebound as far because they're being held by the upper. But that's the big difference here is between the full release versus the no release lumbar. And that's quite significant data. So here's an example, if get away from the data part. This case, she had no releases in the lumbar spine. So here on first standing, you can see a perfect correction. 4 years later, she broke a little bit, still not high enough for revision. It's under 17 degrees. It's not, you're not going to revise it. It looks great. But she did break and she did rebound a little bit. And then we have the bends now that we're going to be coming out with show that there's actually movement even in the thoracic release levels and the lumbar release levels. And so I think that answered that as well. I think we can move on to the next question.